legends, I hope you're all amazing. It is time for another installment of Friday Q&A. To everybody who submitted a question for this week's Q&A, thank you all so much as always. If you would like to submit a question for next week's Q&A, simply put it in the comment section down below. And as always, if you want to support what I do on the channel, there is a link to my Patreon in the video description. And there is a link to the music that I make with my band Ragdoll. You can also grab some free stuff like some free impulse responses, or you can join the Discord server and come and hang out and chat. But for now, let's answer some of these questions. When is Five Killer Riffs going to make a comeback? It is back. I hope you all caught the episode that I did on Extreme and Nuno Betancourt last week. That is one that I had actually started all the way back in December 2020, and it sat there about 70% finished for over a year. So I finally found the time to knock that one off, and it was a whole lot of fun to go through and really dive deep into some of my favorite music. And it's a particular series that I want to do a lot more episodes of this year. That's part of the reason why I am doing videos slightly less frequently this year, as some of you may have noticed. Basically, I just really want to focus on content like that, which is a little bit more in-depth. It does mean that it's a little bit more time and labor intensive though, but stuff like my Patreon really goes a long way to making it possible for me to find the time to do that. So to everybody out there who is either subscribed to the channel or who leaves a comment or who is a patron or who's gone and picked up a Ragdoll CD or vinyl or t-shirt, you all directly make videos like that possible, and it's so awesome to get positive feedback about that. So let me all know which bands you would like me to cover in upcoming episodes of Five Killer Riffs. I've got some ideas. There's some long-standing ones that I really want to dive into that I'm hoping to tackle next, but I want to do as many as possible because, as we all know, there are so many killer riffs out there. I talked about the 80s last week. What's my opinion on music from the 90s? My hot take about the 90s is that a lot of it existed kind of as a reaction to what happened in the 80s. And I think a lot of people tend to interpret that as either era being a little bit vapid because of that. You know, if you weren't so much into the 80s, maybe some of the rootsier, more authentic sounding stuff that came out in the 90s was more your vibe. Or if you were heavily invested in the aesthetic of the 80s, the 90s might have seemed like a downturn to you. I was talking to a buddy of mine during the week. Shout out to Carl. I hope you're watching this, Carl. And we were talking about how a lot of the time with a particular movement or era, you don't really see the, I guess, the fruits of all those ideas until maybe like a decade later. So for me, I grew up in the 90s, and it really felt like 95, 96 is when there was kind of a big turn in pop culture and quite a few other things in the kind of broader cultural sphere. But I think when people talk about this stuff, they're often talking about pop culture now. And, you know, when stuff like the Spice Girls happened, and then you had, you know, the whole Y2K thing. Anybody out there remember that? That really felt like it gave the 90s its distinct feel. Like you had the Nintendo 64 and you had Pokemon on the Game Boy, and you had stuff like Dragon Ball Z was on the TV, and again, Pokemon and all these Japanese cartoons that really started to feel like a different time. But of course, it felt like a different time because I guess I was growing up at the time as well. Some of my absolute favorite music was made in the 90s as well, whether it's stuff by bands like Soundgarden and Alice in Chains or King's X, or whether it's stuff like the Lemon Parade album by Tonic, which is still one of my favorite albums ever. One thing that I love about the 90s as a guitar decade was it feels like people went back to embracing character tones. If the 80s was all about just trying to do things to the maximum, you know, if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. The 90s was more about going back and saying, hey, you know what, this crummy little fuzz pedal, when you run it through this Fender amp, that just has a sound about it. Let's embrace the sound in the gear rather than trying to chase all these other sounds that, you know, I'm not saying hi-fi is bad or lo-fi is bad or one's better than the other. It just kind of felt like things took a turn in that direction, which I think a lot of people interpret as maybe a turn towards authenticity. But then again, like any era, I said this last time, you have a whole bunch of good stuff and you have a whole bunch of absolute dog shit. Now, for the real contentious question, David Lee Roth or Sammy Hagar in Van Halen. If you asked me this question 10 years ago, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. I just would have said David Lee Roth because it was all about the swagger and the charisma. I read Dave's biography when I was 15 or 16, and it was like reading about a cartoon superhero. I couldn't believe that a person could do all those things in their life. And Dave is such a character. And I think that's what early Van Halen is all about. They are just a band, and those records have so much character about them, whether it's Eddie's guitar playing or his sound, or Michael Anthony's bass playing and backing vocals, Alex's drumming, the way the whole band just kind of gelled. I think Fair Warning is such a great example of that, where it just sounds like they rocked up in your living room and started jamming. Such an organic chemistry in there. But I have totally come around to Sammy Hagar. I really didn't dig Van Hagar at all 10 or so years ago, but the more I listen to it, the more appreciation I have for Sammy's singing, because truly one of the great rock singers ever. But also I think I've warmed up to keyboard sounds and Eddie's songwriting and the way he used synthesizer sounds and the way they just developed as a band, and they had a new sound. It's basically, you know, a new band. And also Right Now came out in the Van Hagar era, and that is probably the best song Van Halen ever wrote. And I remember seeing that music video and hearing that song for the first time on like a 50-cent, you know, pirated DVD from Bali that a friend gave me. And it was one of those sounds that just made me sit down, and everything about it was just, it's just an amazing song. I love that one. It makes you contemplate the meaning of life. So I truly cannot make a choice anymore. I love the Van Hagar era now, and I love the David Lee Roth era. I think if I was going to show somebody Van Halen for the first time, I would hand them Fair Warning, though. So that's probably, I mean, you know, I should hand them Van Halen 1, right? That's the thing to do. But Fair Warning is my favorite Van Halen album, which is probably just going to tip the scales like 50.1% to the David Lee Roth era. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to know if people feel similarly, or if they're like, nah, only Sammy, or nah, only Dave, or any Gary Cherone fans out there. What do I think of the Steve Vai Hydra? I'll put it this way. It's the most Steve Vai thing I have ever seen. And I say that in a good way, because I love how it's kind of melding all these different aesthetic elements of guitar and technology together. You know, the vacuum tubes on there, the Ethernet port, the bass neck that's half fretted and half fretless. It's a pretty wild looking machine, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the whole creative process for that. It's very much in the tradition of stuff Steve has done, like that triple neck gem and the Love Heart guitar from the DLR era. It's cool. I like it. I'm all into those kind of things. I don't think it'll obviously ever be a production guitar. It's designed, I guess, as like a kind of living sculpture or something like that that can make cool guitar noises. And yeah, more power to Steve, because Steve always does interesting things. Let me know what you all think of that. Is it something that you find really curious and interesting like I do, or do you just see it and go, ugh? What do I think of the band Shadow Gallery? They're a band for me that I discovered through the label Inside Out Music, like Symphony X and Arion and Evergrey and Vanden Pla. I think that's how you pronounce that band's name. Very reminiscent of that late 90s, early 2000s underground prog scene, where prog and hair metal were about as uncool as one another, but you had people who were so dedicated to the craft and dedicated to making music like that, that, you know, they kept it alive. And now so much of that stuff really does start to sound a lot more contemporary, especially when it comes to guitar music. So yeah, great suggestion. And any of those bands that I mentioned, I would highly recommend people who enjoy the stuff that I do on this channel go and check them out. I think Shadow Gallery were American, and like Evergrey I know are European, same with Vanden Pla and Arion as well. And obviously you got to go and check out Symphony X and Michael Romeo, and I think they're American as well. So it was this interesting like Atlantic prog era. That's probably how I would describe it. I mentioned that I keep a truss rod adjustment tool in my guitar bag that I take to every single gig. How often do I use that? Honestly, once in a blue moon. I basically carry it out of habit because in Australia, often when it's hot and humid, it's hot and humid everywhere. So your guitars are, you know, kind of going to warp a little bit anyway. But I found that one particularly useful touring the US, where you have a lot of changes in altitude. I remember doing one drive where we went from Missouri to New Mexico and then all through Arizona and ended up in LA over the course of 4 or 5 days. And I definitely had to do some truss rod adjustments there. And same thing in Europe, going north to south. We did a gig in the south of France and then we did a gig up in Denmark. And that was just one of those cases where you start getting buzz in weird places and you need to give it a tweak. But when I'm doing gigs locally, honestly, it's kind of just habit, and maybe once every 12 to 18 months, I might need to give it a little truss rod tweak at a gig, but I try to keep that to a minimum. This question comes from my buddy Rutger. What would I go with if I could only have the Eventide Tricera chorus or the micro pitch for something to do that kind of 80s Iron Maiden Somewhere in Time tone? I think if you don't need the delay aspect, then Tricera chorus, because it has tri-chorus and it has detune, is probably the way to go. But if you want something that can do those like 80s Michael Thompson style delays, where you've got delays with detune on them and feedback and the ability to have envelope modulation, then the micro pitch is probably the way to go. They cover so much similar ground, but I think a lot of people probably have a delay pedal kicking around, in which case running something like Tricera chorus would make sense. I think I did a video with that, the Free the Tone Future Factory and the Meris Mercury 7, which you can check out. And that was an amazing combination for sort of 80s style tones. And I should do a few more videos like that. I've actually got a pedal board on order, which I'm looking forward to building and doing a video with, which is a nice compact little board that can fit 3 to 4 pedals on it. So hopefully I will be able to do some more like 5-minute tone with pedal style videos coming up. Would I recommend the Focusrite IV i4 for a tiny little interface if you need MIDI? I used to have the 18i6, and the fact that that had MIDI on it was very, very handy. I think it had MIDI on it anyway, but I remember using stuff like the Axe-Fx and, you know, the original Axe-Fx we're talking about here, the Ultra, which didn't have a USB interface on it, and having MIDI in and out ports. I might be crazy, or maybe I had that on my 11 rack. But anyway, it meant that you could run 2 MIDI cables and use the editor there without having to use a MIDI to USB converter. And you know, if you've got stuff that has MIDI on it, then it's obviously very handy. Or you could use a small interface like that with MIDI to automate preset changes on your modeler, provided it has a MIDI in. And I have some videos doing Pro Tools automation with the Axe-Fx if you're interested in that specific use case. Chris Poland, specifically the Damn the Machine record. I actually haven't checked that one out, so thank you for the suggestion right there. I really like Chris's lead playing, and Chris is kind of one of the forgotten heroes of 80s thrash guitar, obviously because Megadeth ended up having Marty Friedman in the band and then all the other amazing guitar players. But I think Chris's lead playing was a big part of the early signature Megadeth sound. And I have checked out some of Chris's solo stuff and some guest spots that they've done on other albums. And he just has such a unique tone and such a unique touch. It's very much a finesse approach, whereas I think a lot of other thrash players just kind of have, you know, the brute force approach where they just try to, you know, think of someone like Kerry King, for example, where it's all tremolo picking and whammy bars, whereas Chris was kind of coming from the fusion world and almost had a very, you know, contemporary sensibility. I'm talking about contemporary now, where a lot of players use that legato approach to playing metal. And yeah, I'm gonna go and check that one out. Thank you so much for that suggestion. One last one for this week. Tips to make a 3-piece band sound full. Get your bass player to use some distortion on their bass guitar tone. That is one great way to fill out the sound, because having kind of plinky clean bass in a rock band anyway can be great when you have other instruments in there, but you know, just get your bass player a Sans amp or a Dark Glass or something like that and put some grit on the bass tone. With guitar, using time-based effects, I use a lot of rhythmic delay effects live with Ragdoll to fill out sections. And I always kind of feel like if it's a chorus, then I'm going to be down the low end of the guitar, absolutely chunking out, filling up as much space. But in the verses, I'll try to bring the guitar part sort of towards the middle register and use time-based effects to kind of fill out the sound and contrast what the rest of the band is doing. I think you have to pick and choose your times to be on 11 in a 3-piece band and embrace the fact that there is space, and embrace the fact that in a live setting, drums are really loud and bass guitar is really loud, and those things fill a room, and you want your guitar to still work around that. So figure out the points in an arrangement. I guess this comes down to arranging as much as tone, where figure out the parts and arrangement where you want the band to be as heavy as possible, and then try to scale everything relative to that. I think of a ragdoll song like Rewind Your Mind, where the main chorus has this kind of King's X, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains style drop C blues scale riff happening throughout the main chorus, and the bass is doubling that, and the kick drum is hitting those same accents. I think getting the bass and the kick drum to play a lot of similar accents, you know, listen to Queensryche or listen to King's X to get some ideas there. And then in the verses, the bass guitar is playing really tight with the drums, but the guitar is playing this rhythmic delay part that just kind of contrasts all of that and leaves space for the vocal melody. I could go on and on about this, but they're some of my quick and furious tips for filling out the sound in a three-piece. If that's something you would like to know more about, again, feel free to ask me about it again for next week's questions. If you got questions for next week, put them in the comments. Otherwise, have a fantastic weekend. I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching.